Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and of course a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. This is your host, Elizabeth Townsend Guard, law professor at Tulane University Law School, and you know, I just wanna quilt. So today we have a famous quilter stopping by. So insanely cool. Stephanie Kendron of Modern Sewciety stops by to chat with us about her podcasting life, her quilting life, and her new adventure, which is called Modern Sewciety, which is part of Modern Sewciety. That's a membership thing. If you just love her so much, you want to do more with her. Anyway, super fun. So psyched she's here. Let's chat with Stephanie.
My name is Stephanie Kendron, and I am calling from North Florida.
Awesome. Well, Stephanie, I'm super, super psyched to talk to you. Modern Sewciety, and that's Sewciety. Modern Sewciety is it's like the gold standard in quilt podcasts. And I'm super psyched to be chatting with you. So welcome, and thanks for being willing to talk.
Well, I'm blushing because that was an amazing introduction, and if I can get the gold, not at the Olympics, but in podcasting for sewing, I'll take it.
That sounds good. I think we do need to have a quilting Olympics, and that's totally what we should have. I think that's great. All right, so we start every episode with the first question, which is, what's your first memory of someone sewing or quilting in your life?
I remember my mom and my grandma. I think when I was pretty small, my grandma crocheted more than she sewed, but I remember she would we lived in this little farming community, and she would go down the road, real rural, a lot of farms around us, and all of the farmers' wives would go to the church, and they had this big frame that they would put quilts on and hand quilt it together. I don't ever remember attending one of those with her, but I remember that they did that, and it was, you can say so.
That's interesting. When did you start quilting for real? When did you start quilting?
Well, I remember when I got out of high school and I was in college, one of my friends got pregnant, and it was a really good friend. So I said, my mom had always made clothes for me growing up and stuff. So I said, I'm going to make a quilt for her, and went to Walmart and got some Winnie the Pooh fabric, and did not do a very good job of making her a quilt, although I did give it to her with some major pride. But now looking back, I'm pretty sure that didn't make it through too many washes. And then I really started seriously quilting and sewing when my oldest daughter was born, which was 10 years ago.
Wow. And so when did you start doing Modern Sewciety, and what was the impetus for doing it?
So we had tried to buy this house that we really, really liked 4 or 5 times, and it finally went into foreclosure, and we got it for a steal. And when we were working on it, we did everything. We totally came in and painted the house and redid the floors and redid a lot of stuff in 2 weeks. We had 2 weeks because it was a foreclosure. It was a really short turnover. And my husband would walk around with headphones on. And I'm like, what are you listening to? And he said, podcasts. You should see if there are any sewing podcasts. So I did, and I really liked it. And I said, I could do this with all the people that I want to know about in the sewing industry, because blogs, when I started sewing in 2007, were just coming on the scene. And I knew all of these people who sewed through their blogs, but I kind of wanted to ask them questions that weren't on their blog, like, how do you get your sewing mojo back when you lose it? Or what is your favorite designer? Or ask the designer, why did you make this one fabric line? What was the inspiration? Or how do you do it? And so when we moved into this house and I kind of discovered podcasts, my kids at that time were both in school. And that was a new kind of thing for me. They hadn't both been in school my youngest daughter was only in school until 11:30, so I had from 8 o'clock until 11:30, and I just started then. And the whole idea behind it was to really kind of tell my story. I like to talk. I'm a conversationalist, and also to get to know some of these people in the industry that I was curious, to be honest. I guess that was it. I was just really curious.
And so how did you get your first guests? How did you sort of go about contacting people, and how receptive were they when you first started?
I was fearless. And it's funny, I'm not a big fearless person. I'm actually a worrier, and I overthink things. But at that time, it was just this weird time in my life where I was in this dream house that we had really wanted to be in. My kids were transitioning to both of them being at school for a certain amount of time during the day. And it was almost this new life that I had. And I decided that I was going to do it, and then didn't really think too much about it and did it. And Katie from Katie's Quilting World, she is Katie's Quilting Corner. Sorry, Katie, that I just messed that up. But she had a podcast, so I reached out to her. She also lives in Florida, and I just said, hey, I'm trying to do this. I'm having some trouble with some of the logistics, and she was so incredibly helpful. That is the only reason that I really had success starting, is because Katie really did walk me through everything. She was instrumental in making it happen. And then once I got going, it wasn't that bad. Once you figure out everything with podcasting, I think it's not as hard. It's the starting that's really hard.
Yeah, because there's a lot of parts to starting. Like I don't think people realize how much just like the logo and the equipment and where you're going to post it, and there's just a lot. There's a lot of having done it this last week. It's exhausting.
And you have to get your RSS feed to iTunes, and you have to have it hosted on a certain thing. All of those things. Katie really just said, this is what I do, and I just took her word for it and kind of followed her lead.
That's really great. Now, how often do you interview? When you interview people, do you interview in like a cluster, like do a bunch of interviews and then post them later, or do you do like an interview a week, or sort of how do you do the scheduling on your podcast?
I have changed the way that I have done the podcast in the last 6 months to a year, and I really like it. It doesn't work for everybody, but I think for the way that my podcast is set up, it's not time sensitive.
Yeah.
I did in the beginning every week call someone every week. That was what I put up for the podcast. So it was mainly, call someone, have that, and I just did that once a week, and I put that podcast up. But now I do it totally different. I actually, in the last 2 weeks, have recorded up enough episodes for like 2 or 3 months.
That's great.
It is. And for me, it works because, like I said, it's not super time sensitive, but then I can also have other aspects to my business that I can keep up with.
Yeah.
Because it does really take a lot to, especially when I'm on the East Coast and I have to talk to people in other time zones, it can get really frustrating. So to do it all at one time and to just have all of those different time zones and deal with that all in 2 weeks, it works out a lot better for me.
Yeah, I try to do that as well, because I found that when I put it, like, I usually try to, right now we're on Mardi Gras break, so it kind of doesn't matter when we do the interviews, but if it's like within my regular daily life, I sometimes forget that we have interviews, because it's like it needs to be sort of clustered, because it's just out of the ordinary. It's like, oh right, I'm supposed to be talking to someone right now. It's not good. So I've gotten more deliberate on the scheduling.
I will say too that I have realized I have a real life and that it is not always the podcast.
Right.
And so for me, I know my schedule is going to be crazy at certain parts of the year. And that always was really hard for me because, my kids would have things, or, like when I knew that flu season was coming, I knew that there was a good chance that we might have a sick kid at home or whatever. So I've kind of learned to schedule all those recordings So when that little stuff comes up in my family life, I'm not embarrassing myself and saying I really have to reschedule and do that 2 times or something. And that did happen in the beginning, and I actually had the embarrassing things like, hey, we've had to reschedule too much and I'm just going to give up on this. You have too many things going on. Right. And it was true. I did. I had little kids. So right. I've learned now that blocking this 2 weeks will also give me time in the next 2 months to be a mom. That's
really important. Scheduling is really challenging. Do you use Calendly? Is that what you use for scheduling?
Calendly, yes, Calendly, I do.
Too.
Now I like it. There's another scheduler that will actually send a thank you after your scheduled time, and I wish that Calendly had that, but it doesn't. For good free service, I think Calendly does a great job.
Yeah, it does.
And it does time zone differences, and you don't have to figure that out.
Yeah, and the other thing is that as long as you are – when I've gotten into trouble is when I don't put it into my calendar that I have something, because that's my favorite part is that it takes out the blocks that you've done if you have some sort of conflict, which is – and then puts it into the Outlook, which is great, so that it all sort of is seamless and all that. So it's really been great. All right. So
now, I haven't integrated it into my regular calendar yet. That is a really phenomenal idea.
It's fantastic because if your kid, like my kid has something going and I had a time, like I had from 9 to 3 that you could have, but now suddenly I have to do something at noon, it'll take that part out so that people can't sign up. That was one of the problems I was having is I'd have a faculty meeting and I hadn't put it in my calendar, and so now I had an interview and a faculty meeting, and so I had to get more strict with my calendaring so that it didn't mess me up. So
yeah, and that's a really good tip for anybody listening. I really wanted to be available for everyone all the time when I started out, and I know that this is not everyone, but I will say, there are other aspects to my business that I have to do, and I'm also a wife and a mom, and I kind of got strict, like you said. I kind of got really strict about these are the hours that I'm available. If they don't work for you, then you can always email me and say, hey, I'm in Australia, and none of those times work for me.
Right.
But I do feel like be strict with that time. It's your time, and if it doesn't work for the person that you want to interview, they'll always let you know.
Yeah.
But don't put times on there that you really don't want to do. Think about that. If you don't want to talk at 8 o'clock in the morning, take that off the table. It's going to be okay. You can find another time to make it work.
Right. Well, that's really good advice. So how does the podcast fit within your larger business?
Good question. I think that the podcast really took up so much of my time, and it was really learning what I wanted it to be, how I wanted it to be. And I really feel like in the last year, and I'm going on year 5, I think. I think now this year I'm more confident than ever with my podcast and where I want it to fit in my business. I think I let it dominate my business for a really long time and thought that was the only thing that I was doing. I think I'm going to do more this year where I really want to release patterns this year, and I have a blog of the month called Modern Sewciety this year. Those things I've always wanted to do, but I've let the podcast dominate for a really long time. And so now I'm letting the podcast almost be not an accessory, but not my whole business. I think it's going to be one part of my business, and there will be other parts as well.
That's really cool. Tell me about, I'm at your blog, on your website now. Tell me about Modern, how do you say it? I'm not very good at saying anything. So it's the first one.
The Socialite?
Socialites. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about Modern Socialites.
So Modern Sewciety is, I felt this real disconnect between my podcast listeners and my podcast, which I love that my podcast listeners always tell me, like, I really love that interview, or, hey, can you ask these questions? That isn't what I'm talking about. I felt like there was a disconnect, and I wanted to know more about my listeners. I wanted to know their story. I can't talk to every